In a luxury dealership, a simple-looking man is the target of laughter and contempt for daring to dream big before those who believe they can measure value by appearance. Every word said against him carries a silent judgment and an arrogant certainty of superiority. But in the midst of the embarrassment, a calm and unexpected attitude begins to invert the weight of that scene. What seemed to be just another everyday humiliation transforms into a moment capable of exposing truths that no one there was prepared to face. Before discovering how a single call changed everything, don't forget to subscribe for more stories full of twists and unforgettable lessons. Traffic on Brigadeiro Faria Lima Avenue had been stopped since the overpass, as happened almost every Thursday in the early afternoon. Inside a white 2018 Corolla, without any stickers or details that drew attention, Henrique Castelo observed the line of cars with the patience of someone who learned, over the years, that haste rarely solved what waiting solved better. He was 43 years old, with discreet broad shoulders under a simple cotton shirt, beige dress pants, and brown shoes without any visible brand. His hair was slightly disheveled by the wind coming through the half-open window, and his reading glasses rested on the dashboard as if they were a forgotten detail. Nothing about him suggested urgency. Nothing about him suggested power. The cell phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was a message from Adriana, his assistant, confirming the address. Henrique read it without expression, typed only, "Okay," and went back to looking at the avenue. On the right side, through the glass, he could see the glass facade of one of the most talked-about establishments in the São Paulo automotive sector in the last 2 years. The Ventura Premium dealership occupied an entire building on the side of one of the most valued streets of Faria Lima, with 3 floors of cars displayed under carefully designed technical lighting to make each vehicle look like a sculpture. At the entrance, 2 security guards in dark suits flanked the glass revolving door like museum sentinels. The facade was white and cold, with the logo engraved in brushed aluminum. Everything there communicated a very clear message about who was welcome and who was not. Henrique parked the Corolla in a street spot 2 blocks away. There was no apparent reason for this. There were spots available in the dealership's covered parking lot, but he preferred to enter on foot like any ordinary person would. He took only his cell phone, no briefcase, no card in hand, no sign of identification. He walked slowly. He observed the sidewalk, the movements around him, the way the employees outside treated those arriving in imported cars versus those arriving on foot. These were details that most people didn't register. Henrique registered everything. The revolving door opened with a soft puff of air conditioning. The interior was exactly what the facade promised. Light marble floors, recessed lights in the ceiling, creating precise halos over the varnished hoods, a light smell of leather and cleaning product that seemed designed by some sensory experience specialist. There were 4 cars on the ground floor, a charcoal grey SUV, a white sedan, a red sports coupe, and a black sedan with low lines that cost, Henrique knew by heart, a little over 900,000 reais. 2 sophisticated-looking customers were talking to salesmen in the back. A woman in a structured blazer flipped through a catalogue standing near the counter. Instrumental music filled the environment with a calculated lightness. Henrique stopped in the center of the showroom. He looked at the cars with genuine attention, not like someone pretending interest, but like someone truly evaluating. He stood still for a few seconds, waiting for someone to approach. No one came. One of the salesmen in the back looked in his direction, did a quick scan from top to bottom, and returned to the conversation with the customer already being served. The other turned slightly aside. The woman at the counter pretended not to have seen him. Only the young salesman, who was without a customer at the moment, kept looking, with an expression that wasn't exactly curiosity. It was evaluation. His name was Renan. He was 26 years old, 2 years at Ventura, and had developed a particular talent for classifying customers before spending energy on them. His navy blue suit was too tight in the shoulders, his hair gelled back with product, his teeth very white. He let another moment pass, enough to communicate that he was in no hurry, and then walked toward Henrique with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" The question was asked with a tone that implied another unvoiced question, but perfectly audible to those who knew the register. Henrique replied calmly, "I'm interested in the black sedan. I wanted to better understand the available configurations." Renan blinked. A second of silence. Then he smiled again, this time with an addition of something that was hard to name, but easy to feel. "Of course. This model is one of our most exclusive." He made a calculated pause. "Have you had any previous contact with this line?" It was a screening question. Henrique knew the mechanism. "Not directly," he replied, unbothered. "I understand." Renan took a sidestep, like someone guiding a museum visitor. "This one here is the top of the line. V8 engine, Napa leather interior with manual stitching, sound system with 12 speakers. The complete package comes to around 920,000. Another pause. He looked at Henrique's shirt, at the shoes, at the cell phone without a designer case. "We also have other options if you prefer. Slightly more accessible models on the second floor. Great cars as well." Henrique didn't respond immediately. He looked at the sedan. He walked slowly around the vehicle, running his eyes over the hood, the line of the wheels, the finish of the windshield. Renan stood still, with his arms crossed in a disguised way, observing with an expression that oscillated between boredom and discomfort. "What is the delivery time for this model with the sport package?" Henrique asked, without taking his eyes off the car. Renan hesitated. It was a specific question, detailed. It wasn't the question of someone just looking out of curiosity, but it also didn't match the image he had constructed of the man in front of him. "It depends on the stock, normally between 8 and 12 weeks. "And do you work with in-house financing, or do you have a partnership with a bank?" "Partner bank, but for this model most customers opt for cash payment or business leasing." The addition was subtle but intentional. The message was simple. This isn't the kind of purchase one pays for in installments. Henrique nodded slightly. He stood in silence for another moment observing the car. Then he straightened up and said, with the same calmness as before, "Can I see the interior?" What happened next was small, but Henrique didn't let it pass. Renan turned slightly toward the counter, where a colleague, Marcus, according to the name tag, was following the scene closely. The two exchanged a look. Marcus made an almost imperceptible gesture with the corner of his mouth. Renan suppressed a laugh before it became visible, but not completely. "Of course," Renan said, and opened the sedan door with an exaggerated formality that wasn't respect. It was performance, the kind of attention given to something one doesn't take seriously. Henrique got into the car. He sat in the driver's seat. He ran his fingers over the steering wheel, checked the position of the controls, opened the center compartment, checked the multimedia system screen. He was completely present, completely in silence. And it was this silence that began to bother Renan in a way he couldn't explain. There was something in the way the man moved, a confidence that didn't need approval, which didn't fit the narrative Renan had decided to tell about him from the moment he walked through the door. Outside, Marcus approached Renan and said in a low voice, thinking there was no risk of being heard, "Let him play in the car. He's not leaving with it." Renan gave a short laugh. "I bet he doesn't even know how much the insurance costs." Henrique heard it. He didn't react. He closed his eyes for a second, like someone registering something important, and then opened the car door carefully, stepped out, and stood beside the vehicle with the exact same expression as when he had entered. Calm, attentive, completely unalterable. He took out his cell phone, typed something, and then looked at Renan with an expression that the salesman interpreted as surrender. It wasn't. What bothers more than an aggressive response is the absence of a reaction. Renan had learned this very early in his work with public service. People react to what you say, and that reaction, whether anger or embarrassment, confirms that you have power in the situation. But the man in the simple shirt and brown shoes had not reacted, and that, in a diffuse and hard-to-name way, had left Renan in a position of discomfort that he didn't quite know what to do with. While Henrique stood beside the sedan with his phone in hand, Renan retreated discreetly toward the counter, where Marcus was waiting for him. The two stood close, enough to talk in a low volume. "He's typing something," Marcus said. his chin pointing discreetly toward Henrique. "Googling the price," Renan replied with one corner of his mouth lifted. "Soon he'll get to the installment part and vanish." One of the attendants at the counter, Fernanda, heard and suppressed a smile. She was 30 years old, had worked at Ventura for 3 years, and had developed a skill similar to Renan's, but with a smoother veneer on top. She said nothing explicit. She just smiled at the right moment, a millimeter more on one side, and everyone understood. Henrique finished typing, put the phone in his pocket, and walked slowly toward the second car on display in the showroom, the charcoal grey SUV. He stopped in front of it, looked at the wheels, lowered his body slightly to check the chassis height. It was a technical gesture, the kind of check someone makes when they know what they are evaluating. Renan observed. The discomfort grew a degree. "This is the premium off-road model," he said, approaching again with the same smile as before, now slightly more defensive. "Excellent for those who have a country house or travel frequently to the interior." Henrique looked at him. "I see. This model has a problem with the adaptive suspension system in versions prior to 2023. Has it been corrected in the latest ones?" Silence. Renan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I would need to check with the technical sector." "All right." Henrique straightened up. "What is the name of the technical head of this unit?" It was a direct question, simple. But no one usually asked it just like that, in that tone, in that sequence. Renan felt something that wasn't exactly fear, but was in the neighborhood. Tadeu Meireles. "Is he available today?" "He normally doesn't directly serve customers who haven't yet—" Renan stopped. He realized how the sentence sounded before finishing it. "Who haven't yet formalized interest," he completed, trying to soften what had already escaped. Henrique said nothing. He just nodded once and returned his gaze to the SUV. Renan stood beside him in a silence that had stopped being comfortable for the salesman several minutes ago. It was Marcus who broke the tension, coming from the counter with his hands in his pockets, and a tone of voice that tried to sound casual. "Can I ask what your field of work is? Because sometimes we can get special conditions for corporate entities, depending on the segment." It was the question Renan wanted to ask, but hadn't had the courage to. Marcus's reading was the same. The man didn't seem to fit the profile of a Ventura customer, but there was something in his behavior that created a small, annoying doubt that needed to be resolved with concrete information. "Consultancy," Henrique replied without elaborating. "Consultancy in what area?" Marcus insisted, with a smile that wasn't friendly. Henrique looked at him with a completely neutral expression. "Business evaluation." The answer was short enough to reveal nothing, but it carried a weight that neither of them knew how to interpret correctly. Marcus furrowed his brow slightly, trying to understand if that was an evasive answer from someone without real structure, or a deliberately contained answer from someone with more structure than they appeared to have. "Interesting," he said, with a tone that meant the opposite. The store manager, Claudinho, appeared from the stairs leading to the second floor. He was 48 years old, with a slightly prominent belly under his grey suit, and a two-way radio clipped to his belt that he rarely used because he preferred to gesture. He noticed the dynamics of the showroom with the antenna of someone who had spent years in that environment and went to Renan with quick steps, stopping beside him without looking directly at Henrique. "Everything okay?" he asked in a low volume intended to be inaudible, but which wasn't. "Everything," said Renan. "He's looking at the models." Claudinho evaluated Henrique at a glance, with the discretion of someone who imagines they are invisible. He carried one of those manager expressions that says, "I understand everything," without saying anything. He went back to the second floor without offering help, without greeting, without any gesture toward the visitor. Henrique noticed he made a mental note. He kept walking. He went to the white sedan. He scanned the dashboard. He checked the finish of the weld on the inside of the door. He opened the hood with the indicated latch and looked at the engine for a few seconds with genuine attention. When he closed the hood, Fernanda had approached without anyone asking. "This model has an extended factory warranty," she said, with her trained smile and eyes that made a point of checking once again his shoes. "I know," said Henrique. 5 years for structural components, 2 for electrical." but I want to know if the unit offers any personalized after-sales follow-up service or if it works only with the manufacturer's standard. Fernanda was slightly disconcerted. It wasn't the kind of question she expected. It wasn't the kind of question most customers asked at this stage, much less customers who hadn't even sat down with a sales consultant yet. "We have the network's standard loyalty program," she said, choosing her words more carefully now. "The network, or just this unit?" "The whole network." Henrique nodded. He looked at her for a moment. "How many units does the network have?" 17 in Brazil. "And is the controlling group the same as the last 3 years, or has there been any recent change in structure?" Fernanda opened her mouth, closed it. That question was completely outside the script she knew. No customer in the buying process asked about the shareholding control structure. It was a question from another universe. "I don't have that information off the top of my head," she said. "No problem," Henrique replied, with the same absolute calmness as before. He stood for a few more seconds in front of the sedan and then returned to the center of the showroom. He stood still for a moment, facing the black sedan, as if he were making a decision. Renan, Marcus, and Fernanda observed him from different points in the showroom, each with their own version of the same discomfort, each trying to fit that man into some known category and failing. It was then that Henrique took his cell phone out of his pocket. He looked at the screen, dialed a number, waited for 2 rings. "You can come now," he said. Only that. He hung up. Renan and Marcus exchanged a look. Marcus raised his eyebrows in an expression between sarcasm and doubt. Fernanda turned slightly toward the counter, pretending to check something on the computer. "Calling for backup?" Marcus said in a low voice, with a smile intended to be funny. Renan didn't respond, but the smile came. And it was at that moment, in that perfectly lit showroom, in that space designed to make people feel they were being received at the highest level of excellence, that the silent construction of something none of them had predicted began. Henrique put away his cell phone. He walked to the waiting armchair near the entrance, the one with white leather upholstery that seemed never to have been used, and sat with the upright posture of someone completely at ease. He crossed his hands over his knee and waited. There was no anxiety in him. There was no haste. There was only the calm of someone who knows exactly what is about to happen and can afford the luxury of waiting with absolute tranquility. From the counter, Renan continued to observe, and for the first time since the man had entered through the revolving door, a very small but very real doubt began to settle somewhere in the back of his consciousness. Something he couldn't name yet, but which had the specific weight of things that later make a person wonder at what exact moment they went wrong. The first 5 minutes after the call passed, with the artificial normalcy of someone trying to look like they aren't paying attention to something they are. Renan went back to occupying himself with the computer at the counter, but kept his eyes on the glass door every interval of a few seconds. Marcus went to the second floor with the pretext of checking a file. Fernanda typed something into the system, but her fingers were too slow for the typing to be real. Claudinho had come down again and stood at the back of the showroom, standing near a catalogue stand with his arms crossed and an expression that tried to convey indifference but conveyed observation. Henrique remained seated in the white armchair. He hadn't touched his phone since the call. He hadn't looked at his watch. He hadn't made any gesture indicating impatience or discomfort. He had just stayed there, with his back straight, hands crossed over his knee, and his gaze turned slightly toward the entrance like someone waiting for a taxi they know will arrive on time. When the revolving door moved, the first to enter was a man of about 40, in a dark charcoal suit, no tie, firm steps. Right behind him, a woman in a navy blue blazer with a tablet under her arm and an expression of complete professional neutrality. The third was younger, maybe early 30s, carrying a thin black leather briefcase. None of the 3 looked at the cars. None of the 3 stopped to admire anything. They walked in a straight line across the length of the showroom toward the white armchair where Henrique was sitting. The silence that fell over the environment wasn't loud. It was the kind of silence that settles when something changes configuration and the people present are still trying to understand what changed. Renan stopped typing. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs. Fernanda straightened up. Claudinho uncrossed his arms. The man in the charcoal suit reached Henrique and extended his hand with a natural, non-performative deference. "Dr. Castello, did everything arrive well?" Henrique stood up, shook his hand. "All good, Rodrigo. You can set up right here." Rodrigo nodded and made a gesture to the younger man, who opened the briefcase and began to organize documents on the coffee table beside the armchair. The woman in the blue blazer activated the tablet and stood slightly back, like someone awaiting instruction. Claudinho took 2 steps toward the group, with the expression of a manager who just realized something went off script. "Excuse me," he said, in a tone that wanted to be authoritative but was slightly trembling. "May I know who you gentlemen are?" Rodrigo turned to him. He opened the thin briefcase, took out a document and handed it over. Claudinho took it and began to read. What exactly was written on that paper, Renan and Fernanda could not see from where they were, but the effect was visible. The color in Claudinho's face changed in a matter of seconds. It didn't disappear completely, but it became different, like the skin tone of someone who has just received news that forces them to reconfigure everything they thought they knew. "Internal audit," said Rodrigo, with a calmness that was the opposite of any explicit threat, but communicated something much more effective. "Representatives of the Venturas Group, here for the verification of customer service protocols at this unit." Claudinho looked at the document. He looked at Rodrigo. He looked at Henrique, who was standing beside the armchair with the same expression he had had since he walked through the revolving door. Neutral, attentive, completely in control. "Today?" Claudinho said, and the word came out with an involuntary weight that revealed more than he intended. "Visits are unannounced," Rodrigo replied. "That is the methodology." Renan had descended 2 steps on the stairs without noticing. Marcus appeared beside him. Also, without having noticed he had moved, the two were looking at the scene with the expression of someone watching something they understand rationally, but that the body is still trying to process. Claudinho swallowed hard. He made a wide gesture with his arm toward the back of the showroom. "Of course, you can use the meeting room on the 2nd floor. I am at your disposal for whatever you need." "It won't be necessary to go up," Henrique said. It was the first time he had spoken since the 3 arrived, and the effect was that of someone who had just been observing, deciding that the moment to intervene had arrived. "We will conduct it right here, in the showroom, exactly as it happens during a customer visit." Claudinho opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. The woman in the blue blazer, Henrique would call her Dr. Patricia later when formal protocols were established, had already begun to register something on the tablet. With that silent efficiency of someone who is documenting not to threaten, but because documenting is simply what one does. The younger man had separated a set of sheets on the coffee table and was numbering something in the corner of each one. Renan went to the counter, leaned toward Marcus, and said in a voice that barely left his throat, "What is this?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, also in a low voice, but with the frankness of someone who truly doesn't know. Fernanda was pale, not the dramatic paleness of soap operas, but the real paleness of someone who is mentally reconstructing the last 40 minutes and realizing that there are details that were out of place the whole time. Henrique walked slowly through the showroom, as he had done before, but now with Rodrigo at his side and Patricia slightly behind, recording. He stopped in front of the black sedan. He was silent for a moment, as if internally reliving the first time he had stopped there. Then he turned to the group of employees gathered in the back and said, in a voice that was low but reached everyone, "I would like Mr. Renan and Mr. Marcus to step forward, please." The 2 came. There was no way not to come. Renan arrived first with his shoulders slightly stiffened and his face in a visible effort to maintain composure. Marcus came right behind, with his hands in his pockets and an expression that still tried to appear unconcerned. Henrique looked at them for a moment without saying anything. This initial silence was always the hardest, because there was no way to fill it with anything useful. Then he began to speak. "I entered here 38 minutes ago. I came on foot in common clothes without identification. I showed technical interest in the vehicles. I asked specific questions about configurations, delivery times, history of technical problems, and the structure of after-sales services." He paused. During this time, I was received with silent evaluation, comments about my financial capacity, and suggestions that I look for models more suited to my reality. Another pause. All of this is recorded in the observation protocol I conducted since my entry. Renan's face had lost the characteristic lightness of his trained smile. He stood there, still, with nothing special to cover what was underneath. He began. You don't need to respond now, Henrique said. There was no cruelty in his voice. There was something that was almost worse. The absolute calmness of someone who has already drawn all the conclusions they needed to draw and doesn't need any more information to support what is going to happen next. Rodrigo opened one of the documents in the briefcase and began to read in a low voice for Patricia's record. Claudinho had remained motionless at the back of the showroom, with the audit paper still in his hand, like someone holding an object and forgetting they are holding it. And it was at that moment, with the golden afternoon light coming through the windows of the facade and the 900,000 race cars displayed under perfectly calibrated lights, that everyone at Ventura Premium understood that this Thursday had changed irreversibly. Not with noise, not with confrontation, with a 3-word call and 38 minutes of observant silence. The back room of Ventura Premium was normally used for team meetings on Monday mornings, and for Claudinho's quick talks with the salesman when some goal was below expectations. It had an oval dark wood table, 6 chairs upholstered in grey fabric, a whiteboard with coloured markers on a metal tray, and a television on the wall that no one used. The room smelled slightly of old coffee and air conditioning. It was a functional environment, without any of the pretensions of the main showroom. It was there that Claudinho sat at 5 in the evening that Thursday, alone, with his elbows on the table and his hands partially covering his face. The audit paper was in front of him, open, with the Venturis Group logo printed at the top. A group he knew existed, that he knew was the controller of the network, but with whom he had never had direct contact in 5 years as unit manager. Outside the room, in the showroom, the situation had reorganized itself with an efficiency that bothered him more than any open confrontation could have. Renan had been instructed to remain available for a formal interview with Rodrigo. Marcus had been directed to the second-floor reception. Fernanda was responding to a paper questionnaire that the young man with the briefcase had distributed with an impersonality that made it clear this was not a conversation, it was a collection. And Henrique Castello was sitting at the main counter on the inside of the glass with Patricia beside him, reviewing the observation protocol record with the same calmness with which he had evaluated the cars earlier. It was a strange sight to observe through the room's window, the man in the simple shirt and brown shoes sitting at the marble counter of the luxury dealership, not as a customer, but as the most important person in that space. Claudinho took a deep breath. He took his cell phone out of his pocket. He called the direct number he had for regional supervision, a man named Fabricio, who used to show up at the unit every 2 months to check results. The call was answered on the second ring. "Speak, Claudinho." "Fabricio, I need to tell you something that's happening here right now." There was a pause. "I already know," Fabricio said. The tone was different from usual. "The headquarters notified me a little while ago. Don't touch anything. Let the process follow its course." "But I need to understand." "Claudinho," the voice became firmer. "Let the process follow its course." The call ended. Claudinho stared at the phone for a few seconds, and then placed it back on the table with the care of someone putting down something fragile. In the showroom, Henrique had stood up and was walking again across the length of the exhibition space, this time with one of Patricia's clipboards visible between them. He pointed to elements of the environment as he spoke, and she recorded. It was a methodical check: signage, vehicle layout, price visibility, organization of informational materials, the condition of the rear-view mirrors positioned for viewing. The same attention he had brought as a customer he now exercised openly, and the effect on the environment was that of a magnifying glass that reveals what the naked eye cannot reach. Renan was sitting in front of Rodrigo in one of the waiting armchairs. The recording on Rodrigo's cell phone was on the coffee table between them, the icon flashing discreetly. The conversation had begun with questions about standard customer reception procedures, and Renan had responded with the fluency of someone who knows the manual, but the questions became more specific. When the customer entered, Rodrigo said, what was the first element you used to determine the service approach? Renan hesitated. The posture, the interest shown. How long did it take for you to approach for the first contact since he entered? More hesitation. About 2-3 minutes. The network standard is up to 1 minute for first contact with a visitor in an active showroom. Rodrigo said that without inflection, as information, not an accusation. But the effect was the same. What determined the longer time in this case? Renan looked at his hands. There was something there that was honest, not by choice, but because the alternatives were exhausted. I needed to evaluate the profile first. Profile of what? Pause. Of the customer. Do you perform this evaluation with all visitors? The answer didn't come immediately, and it was this pause, more than any words, that Rodrigo recorded with the most attention. On the second floor, Marcus was responding to the questions from the young man with the briefcase with a different style. More defensive, more technical. He had recovered from the initial impact faster than Renan, and was now trying to reconfigure the afternoon's events in a way that sounded acceptable. But the questions from the young man, whose name was Vinicius, as it appeared on the discreet name tag he wore, were designed so that the answers had to be direct, or they sounded too evasive to serve any defensive purpose. When you made the comment about the vehicle's insurance, Vinicius said in a completely neutral tone of voice, what were you referring to specifically? Marcus furrowed his brow. What comment? The comment made to Mr. Renan about the customer not knowing the cost of the insurance. Silence. Marcus looked at the recorder, looked at Vinicius. It was an informal observation between colleagues, made inside the showroom less than 4 meters from the customer. Vinicius did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He just said what there was to say. Shall we continue? Marcus nodded with a head movement too small to be called an agreement, but sufficiently visible to be recorded. Back in the showroom, Henrique had finished the check of the physical environment and approached Fernanda, who still had the incomplete questionnaire in front of her. She raised her eyes when he sat in the chair beside her, not facing her side by side, which created a slightly different dynamic from the formal interrogation happening with the others. Can I ask a few questions while you finish the questionnaire? He said. Yes, said Fernanda. Her voice was stable, but there was a visible effort behind it. When I asked about the group's shareholding structure, Henrique said, what went through your mind? Fernanda was silent for a few seconds. Then, with an honesty that didn't seem calculated, I thought it was a strange question for someone who was buying a car. Why? Because customers don't ask that. What do customers ask? She thought. Color, installments, deadline, warranty. Henrique nodded slowly. And if a customer asks something else, what does that mean? Fernanda looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time since the day had begun to fall apart, completely sincere. That I should pay more attention. It was the most direct and useful answer Henrique had heard all afternoon. He registered it internally, not as absolution, but as a relevant piece of data about the person in front of him. Outside, the sun had descended enough to change the angle of the light coming through the windows, and the cars in the showroom cast long shadows on the marble floor. Ventura Premium, which every morning opened its doors as a temple of the exclusive, was being measured, weighed, and documented with a precision that none of its employees had anticipated when they arrived at work that Thursday. And the process was not over yet. At 6:20 in the evening, when the afternoon light had given way to the external streetlights of Faria Lima, and the pedestrian movement on the sidewalk had changed rhythm, the formal audit protocol was closed with Rodrigo's signature on a set of documents that Vinicius organized in numerical order inside the black briefcase. Patricia deactivated the tablet and put it under her arm with the technical impersonality of someone closing a work tool. The session had lasted exactly 2 hours and 42 minutes. Renan was back at the counter, but different from before. His posture was the same externally, the suit still adjusted, the hair still in place, but there was something in the whole that had disappeared, that performative lightness that was the basis of the character he built for the work environment. What remained in its place was something heavier and, to some extent, truer. Rodrigo approached him with a seriousness that was not hostile. Mr. Renan, Due to what was documented today, you will be removed from customer service until the network supervision concludes the internal analysis. This will be formally communicated tomorrow morning by the regional management. Renan listened without visibly reacting. He nodded once. Rodrigo was already turning away when Renan said, in a voice that was different from everything he had used before, "I misunderstood the situation from the beginning." Rodrigo stopped, turned to him. "How so?" "I had an idea of who he was before hearing him." Pause. "I decided before knowing." It was a confession small in volume, but large in what it cost to make. Rodrigo received it without additional judgment, recorded it mentally, and nodded before moving on. Marcus was informed in a similar way, with the difference that his removal would be accompanied by a broader review, because Vinicius's questions had revealed a pattern of behavior that was not limited to that afternoon's episode. There were other situations, other customers, a way of operating that had become normalized progressively within the showroom space. Claudinho came out of the back room shortly before Rodrigo went to him. He had recomposed his manager's expression, but the audit paper he carried in his hand, slightly crumpled at the edges from being held so tightly, betrayed his internal state. The conversation was formal, direct, and brief. The unit's management would be subjected to a conduct review within the process starting at that moment. There was no immediate removal notice, but there was a commitment to a report to the board in 48 hours. Claudinho heard everything, signed where necessary, and asked only one thing. "Will Mr. Castello return?" Rodrigo replied that yes. No deadline, no additional context. When the three from the audit went out through the revolving glass door with their documents and their tablet, the showroom remained with the 4 employees who were left and the cars motionless under the technical lights, and the silence there had a different quality from the normal end-of-shift silence. It was the silence of those who just understood that something changed but still don't know exactly the size of the change. Henrique had left before them. A few minutes before the formal closing of the protocol, he had stood up, greeted Rodrigo with a brief handshake, and left through the same revolving door he had entered, in the same shirt, the same brown shoes, the same cell phone without a case. Nothing had changed about him externally. It was exactly the same image that had provoked laughter a few hours earlier. On the sidewalk, the air was fresher. He walked the 2 blocks to where he had parked the white Corolla, opened the door with the physical key because he had never configured the automatic opening, and got in. He sat for a few seconds with his hands on the wheel without starting the car. It wasn't hesitation. It was the interval he usually gave himself between the end of one process and the beginning of the next. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Adriana. "Confirmed for tomorrow at 9 a.m. with legal. Do you want me to send the agenda?" He typed, "You can send it, and put it 15 minutes earlier so I can review it alone." Adriana replied with an okay and a time. Henrique started the car and entered the flow of Faria Lima. The city at that hour was dense and noisy, with headlights creating reflections on the asphalt, still damp from a quick rain that had fallen while he was inside Ventura. He drove without haste, with the radio at a low volume playing something that wasn't specific enough to name. 20 minutes later, the Corolla stopped in front of a residential building in Pinheiros. It wasn't the kind of building that appeared in architecture magazines, but it had a discreet solidity that communicated permanence. Henrique parked in the covered spot, took only his phone, and went up the elevator to the 12th floor. The apartment was larger than the building promised from the outside. High ceilings, polished concrete floors, books on shelves that covered the entire living room wall, an integrated kitchen with a dark stone counter. There was a grand piano in a corner that had the discreet dust of something that is loved but used with moderation. The view was of the irregular roofs of Pinheiros, with the subway line visible in the distance, and beyond it, the lights of Paulista lit against the dark sky. He prepared a coffee using the pour-over method, with water at the right temperature and extraction time measured by habit. He stood in the kitchen drinking slowly, looking at the apartment with that expression of someone who is at peace with the space where they live, not because it is perfect, but because it is true. The phone vibrated again. This time, it was a number that started with an international code. He answered, "Henrique." The voice on the other side was of an older man with a slightly different accent, northeastern with years of São Paulo on top. "How was it today?" "As expected," said Henrique. "The unit has a culture problem, not just a procedural one. The individual employees are a symptom. The environment is the cause. Conclusion? I need a week to draft the full report, but the basics you can already anticipate for the board. This unit needs structural intervention, not point-based training." There was a pause. "You know what that means in terms of restructuring costs?" "I do." Henrique finished his coffee. "And I know what it means in terms of reputation costs if it isn't done. The choice is the board's." Another pause. Longer this time. "Will you show up at the board meeting next week?" "I intend to." "Well," the tone changed slightly, became more personal. "You were the only one who insisted that we implement this mystery shopper protocol. I want to hear your full analysis before any decision." Henrique put the cup in the sink. "You will hear it." The call ended. He stood looking at the city for a few seconds through the kitchen window. There was something that wasn't satisfaction in his expression. It was closer to a responsibility fulfilled, the specific feeling of someone who did what was to be done and knows that the real work starts afterward. Because what had happened at Ventura Premium that afternoon was not an isolated case. It was a sample. And Henrique knew, better than anyone in that illuminated building on Faria Lima, exactly the size of what that sample represented. The following week began with a board meeting that lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes on the 24th floor of a tower on Paulista Avenue. The room had views of both sides. On one side, the compact buildings of the historic center. On the other, the vertical expansion toward Jardins. It was a serious work environment designed to communicate that the decisions made there had weight. And they did. Henrique Castello arrived 7 minutes early, as was his habit. He wore a light blue shirt with a collar slightly different from the previous one, well-cut dark pants, black leather shoes. He still had no ostentatious details, no visible cufflinks, no watch that asked for attention. But there was a subtle difference between the way he entered that room and the way he had entered Ventura. Here, the people who saw him pass raised their eyes slightly with a recognition that needed no introduction. The board consisted of 8 people. 3 were executives from the network's operation, the CEO of Venturas Brazil, the operations director, and the head of expansion. 2 were representatives from investment funds with a stake in the group. 1 was the legal consultant, and 2 were direct shareholders who participated in board meetings with variable frequency depending on the agenda. One of those 2 was Henrique. When the report on the visit to Ventura Premium was presented, there was an atmosphere that wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but had the specific tension of someone who is about to receive information they already suspect, and yet would prefer not to confirm. The CEO, Mauricio Andrade, was 61 years old, with the physical presence of someone who had spent their entire life in negotiation environments and had learned not to let premature reactions show. But when the data was put on the screen, the documented speech, the service timeline, the deviations from the standard protocol verified at multiple points of the visit, he stood motionless for a moment that everyone noticed. "This is not an individual failure," Henrique said after the report had been read. "It is the result of an environment where judgment based on appearance was normalized over time, probably gradually, probably without anyone making an explicit decision that this would be the standard, but it reached a level where it became visible and documentable in less than 40 minutes of observation." The operations director, Silvana, looked at the data on the screen. "How many other units do you estimate have the same problem?" "I don't know. That is the right question, and the answer is, we need to verify." He opened a simple presentation on his laptop, shared it with the projector. "I recommend a cycle of systematic mystery shopper visits across all 17 units over the next 3 months, standardized methodology, trained team, comparative report at the end." "That has a cost," said one of the fund representatives, Marcos Betancourt, with the objectivity of someone who translates everything into numbers. "It does," Henrique agreed. "And it is significantly lower than the cost of a reputation crisis on social media, when a customer documents and publishes an episode like the one on Thursday. He paused. Which, in this specific case, did not happen for obvious reasons, but it could have happened, and it will happen in some other unit if we do nothing. Mauricio Andrade was silent for a few seconds. Then, I want the detailed implementation plan in a week. Team, schedule, methodology, and cost per unit. I already have a preliminary proposal, Enrique said, and opened the next document. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. When it ended, decisions had been made with a clarity that the report had made inevitable. The Faria Lima unit would be subjected to a team and culture restructuring process, led by the operations director, with external support. The systematic visit process would be approved and started within 30 days, and a working group would be formed to review the service protocols of the entire network in light of what had been identified. Enrique left the meeting with Silvana at his side, both walking toward the elevator. "Did you know what you were going to find when you walked into that store?" she asked. "I had a hypothesis," he replied. "Based on the satisfaction indicators of that unit over the last 2 years, it was below the network average for unconventional profile customers. The classification the system uses for customers who arrive without visible markers of high purchasing power." Silvana furrowed her brow. "And does that category formally exist in the system?" "Not by that name, but the pattern exists in the data. I went to verify if the data corresponded to reality." He pressed the elevator button. It did. The doors opened. They entered. "Why didn't you go by car?" Silvana asked with the direct curiosity of someone who is also good at asking the right questions. "Because going by car changes the variable I was testing," he said. The doors closed. There was a detail that Silvana had not asked and that Enrique had not offered spontaneously, because it wasn't the time. But it was a detail that, sooner or later, would need to enter the conversation. The mystery shopper program had not been an idea Enrique had had that week, nor that month. It was something he had formally proposed to the board 18 months earlier, in a meeting where the proposal had been received with politeness and filed away with efficiency. What had changed was not the idea, it was the context. And the context had changed because the network's satisfaction data had continued to deteriorate slowly but measurably, to the point where ignoring the proposal required more effort than implementing it. Outside on the street, while Enrique waited for the Corolla in a blue label spot, the phone rang, a number he knew. "Fabricio," he said, answering. "Enrique, I wanted to call before the formal announcement." It was the regional supervisor's voice, more contained than usual. "Fernanda asked to be kept on. She said she was the only one who admitted the error. Did you see that in the report?" "I did." "And what is your position?" Enrique was silent for a moment. "My position is that admitting the error doesn't undo the error, but it says something about the person. And what I needed to evaluate was the systemic pattern, not destroy individuals. If the restructuring is well conducted, there is room for those who decide to change." Pause. "But that is an operational decision, not mine." "Understood," Fabricio breathed. "You were always tough, but you were never unfair." "Tough is when the standard is clear and the consequences are proportional," Enrique said. "The rest is personal, and personal doesn't help." The call ended. The Corolla arrived. Enrique got into the back seat this time. He had requested a driver for the day because he had reading to do on the way back. He opened a document on the tablet he had brought in his backpack and began to read a report from another unit in a different city, with a set of indicators that created a pattern similar to what he had seen at Faria Lima. São Paulo passed outside the window, dense and indifferent, as always, and Enrique read with the silent concentration of someone who knows that real work rarely happens at the moment it becomes visible to others. It happens before. In the careful reading of data, in the precise choice of the question, in the decision to go on foot, in a common shirt, to verify with his own eyes what the paper already suggested. And there was a third layer to this story that had not yet been revealed to anyone outside the board. A layer that would change, retroactively, the meaning of everything that had happened at Ventura Premium that Thursday. But that part would come at the right time, when conditions were right for it to have the weight it deserved. 3 weeks after the visit, Ventura Premium of Faria Lima reopened after 4 days of closure for what had been communicated externally as system updates and environment renewal. Internally, everyone who was part of the team that Thursday knew it was something different. 2 employees did not return. Claudinho had been relocated to the administrative supervision of a smaller unit in Guarulhos, in a decision communicated as lateral but which no one interpreted that way. Renan returned. This had surprised some people, including Renan himself. The process had been long for a 3-week interval. There had been a formal meeting with HR, a mandatory 2-day training in a program the network had developed years ago but never consistently implemented, and a final interview with the unit's new manager, a woman named Cristina, who had been promoted from the Moema unit with a history of indicators that made her the obvious choice for whoever was rebuilding that store's environment. Cristina was 42 years old, with short hair, a direct way of speaking that wasn't harsh, but also left no room for double interpretation. In the interview with Renan, she had asked only one thing before anything else. "Why do you want to come back?" Renan had been silent for a moment that was genuine, not calculated. Then he said, "Because I haven't learned how to do it right yet, and leaving now would be the easiest way not to have to learn." Cristina had looked at him for a few seconds, then, "You start on Monday." There was a difference in the showroom when Renan returned. It wasn't an obvious difference in the environment structure. The same cars, the same marble, the same calibrated lights. It was a difference in temperature, the feeling that the unwritten rules of the place had been rewritten, this time out loud, and that everyone present had heard. The service protocol was revised and printed in a laminated version for each point of the counter. It wasn't a long or complicated document. Welcome every visitor within 1 minute, without prior profile evaluation, with complete information about all models regardless of the perceived range of interest. It seemed simple, and it was. The issue was that simple had never been the same as easy. Meanwhile, in other parts of the city and in other cities, the cycle of mystery shopper visits Henrique had proposed had begun to produce data. Of the 6 units already visited, 3 showed worrying patterns. One of them, in Alphaville, had generated an even more detailed report than the one from Faria Lima, with documentation of episodes that went beyond differentiated service and touched on variable pricing practices that the legal board would need to evaluate carefully. Henrique was in his apartment in Pinheiros on a Tuesday afternoon when Adriana called with the data update. "Alphaville's preliminary report is ready. Rodrigo will send it in 2 hours." "I've already seen the draft," he said. "Before closing, you need to check item 4 of section 2. There is a possible interpretation that can be refuted if not well-founded." "Understood. Anything else?" "Is there any update on Fernanda?" Pause. She was promoted to customer service supervisor in the new Faria Lima structure. Cristina made the request last week. Henrique was silent for a moment. "All right." There was something in this information that he received with more than professional indifference. Fernanda had been the only one who, at the moment of greatest pressure, had responded with honesty without calculation. It was a small detail that made a difference in the complete picture he had constructed of that environment, and which, deep down, was exactly the kind of data that formal customer satisfaction indicators never captured. But there was something else happening that Tuesday week, something Adriana didn't know, that Rodrigo didn't know, that most of the board had not yet fully processed, information that had circulated internally after the board meeting and was about to become official. The Venturas Group had received a merger proposal from a European conglomerate with operations in 19 countries, and the due diligence to evaluate this proposal included, among other criteria, an evaluation of the organizational culture of the network's units, exactly the kind of evaluation that Henrique's mystery shopper process was producing. The timing had seemed like a coincidence to those who didn't know. To those who knew, it was no coincidence at all. Mauricio Andrade had called Henrique the previous Friday with a question that few were in a position to ask so directly. "Did you know about the merger proposal when you proposed the visit program?" I knew there was European interest in the group for at least 8 months, Henrique said, and I knew that any professional due diligence process would examine organizational culture. The proposal was necessary regardless of the merger. The merger just made the timeline more relevant. Mauricio was silent for a few seconds, then, "You never act in only one direction at the same time. The problem is always multiple," Henrique responded. "The solution has to keep up." Back on Tuesday, he closed the laptop with the draft of the Alphaville report and stood looking at the wall of books in the living room. There was a volume on management philosophy between a collection of novels and a set of bound reports from previous years. The book had a slightly worn spine. It was clearly one that had been read more than once. The phone rang. It was a number he didn't immediately recognize. He answered, "Mr. Costello." The voice was young, female, with a specific nervousness of someone who prepared what they were going to say, but still hesitates at the beginning. "Yes. My name is Fernanda Rios. I work at Ventura Premium in Faria Lima. I was promoted this week to customer service supervisor." A pause. "I know I shouldn't call directly, but I managed to get the contact from corporate HR and asked them to pass it on. I want to apologize personally for what happened." Henrique was silent for a moment. There was something in this call that was unusual, not for the initiative itself, but for the form. There was nothing in Fernanda's speech that sounded strategic. There was no calculation about how the call would be received. It was just the gesture of someone who had decided they wanted to do that and had found a way to do it. "Accepted," he said, with a simplicity that matched the honesty of her approach. "Thank you." A pause. "Can I ask one thing?" "You can." "When you were sitting in that white armchair after the call, waiting for the others to arrive, did you know exactly what was going to happen?" Henrique looked through the window at the roofs of Pinheiros. "I knew what was possible to happen," he said. "What actually happens is never exactly the same as what was planned. What matters is being ready for the variations." There was a long pause on the other side. Then, "That makes sense. It's a good orientation for customer service supervision too," Henrique said. Fernanda gave a small, genuine laugh. Then, "Thank you, Mr. Costello." "Good luck, Fernanda." The call ended. He stood looking at the city for a few more seconds. Then he went back to the laptop, opened the Alphaville report, and continued from where he had stopped. The extraordinary board meeting was called for a Monday morning, with the official agenda described only as presentation of external data and strategic deliberation. It was the kind of language the board used when the subject was big enough not to be named directly in an email that would circulate through multiple inboxes before reaching the final recipient. Henrique arrived 10 minutes early, as always, this time in a suit, because he had evaluated that the meeting called for it. Not an ostentatious suit, a work suit, discreet dark blue without an elaborate lapel, without any detail that asked for attention. The message was the same as always: presence without performance. Mauricio Andrade was standing near the window when Henrique entered. He turned with an expression that combined satisfaction and gravity in the same tone, which was the characteristic trait of someone who spent decades making decisions that had real consequences. "Good morning, Henrique." "Good morning, Mauricio. Did you read what I sent last night?" "I did." The proposal had arrived formalized last Friday. The Group Arismont, a conglomerate based in Lyon with operations in 19 European countries and 4 Asian ones, had presented a binding offer for majority control of the Venturas Group Brazil. The value was significant, above what any market evaluation had projected in the last 2 years. But there were conditions. There were always conditions. The main one was the one that mattered most at that moment. The Group Arismont had included an operational integrity evaluation clause in the offer. In practical terms, this meant that any ongoing process of conduct review or cultural restructuring within the network would be examined as part of the due diligence. Companies that arrived at a merger in the middle of reputation crises arrived with a reduced price. Companies that arrived with documented and ongoing self-correction processes arrived with a different kind of conversation. The mystery shopper program that Henrique had proposed, and which had started with the visit to Faria Lima that Thursday, was now, retroactively, one of the most relevant assets of the negotiation. The board gathered over the next 15 minutes. When everyone was seated, Silvana took over the conduct with a synthesis that went straight to the point. Arismont's offer was on the table, the deadline for a response was 21 days, and there were 3 interrelated decisions to make: the continuity of the network's cultural restructuring process, the response to the merger proposal, and each board member's position regarding what would happen to the control structure after the eventual integration. It was at this point that the revelation came, not with drama, with the sobriety of someone presenting a relevant fact that the other side had not yet fully processed. Silvana opened a document on the screen. It was a shareholding chart of the Venturas Group Brazil. There were no names: Mauricio with his historical stake, the 2 funds with their quotas, the other smaller partners, and there was a line that pointed to a holding company whose name, Castelo Participações, was not widely known outside the innermost circle of the board. Castelo Participações, Silvana said, with the precision of someone who chose that moment deliberately to name what was on the screen, currently holds 12.8% of the Venturas Group Brazil, distributed in direct and indirect stakes acquired over 6 years. She looked at Henrique. Which means that Mr. Castelo, in addition to his function as an independent consultant for the network, is also one of the group's shareholders. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. There wasn't complete surprise on every face. Mauricio already knew, Silvana already knew, and the legal consultant had managed the legal aspects of this position. But there were board members who had not crossed this information, and there were fund representatives who were processing the implications of this dual position in real time. Marcos Betancourt, the fund representative who had mentioned the cost of the mystery shopper visits, stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then he looked at Henrique. You proposed the visit program as an external consultant, but you have a stake in the group as a shareholder. Correct, said Henrique, which makes the program simultaneously a service recommendation and a shareholder decision. Also correct. Doesn't that create a conflict? Henrique responded with a calculated pause, not to gain time but to give weight to what would come. There would only be a conflict if the 2 interests were divergent. As a consultant, my recommendation was that the network needed cultural self-correction to maintain the standard of excellence that justifies its premium positioning. As a shareholder, my interest is for the group to preserve and expand its value. He paused. These 2 interests point in the same direction. Betancourt was silent then. And the merger proposal? As a shareholder, I have the right to vote in the deliberation, but my technical recommendation, in the role of consultant, is independent of the outcome of the vote. Henrique opened the document he had prepared. What I can offer the board is an analysis of the Arismont offer that clearly separates the 2 roles, where I am acting as a technical evaluator and where I am exercising a preference as a shareholder. This is documented in this material. The legal consultant, who had been silent until that moment, said, from a regulatory point of view, the position is within what is permitted, provided there is transparency in the deliberation. And there is. Mauricio made a slow head gesture that was simultaneous approval and closure. We continue. The meeting went on for another 2 hours. At the end, the decision had been made by majority. The board would authorize a formal response of interest to the Arismont proposal, with the opening of due diligence to be conducted in the following 45 days, and with the commitment to present the buyer with the full data of the cultural restructuring program as part of the presentation material. When the others left, Mauricio stayed with Henrique in the empty room. The city outside the window was in that state of constant movement that São Paulo never completely abandons. You calculated the timing, Mauricio said. It wasn't a question. I calculated that there was a moment when all the variables would be at the right point, Henrique said. The Arismont proposal, the visit program, the network restructuring. Each of these things is necessary on its own, but when they converge in the same period, the result is different from what it would be if they were separate. And the visit to Faria Lima was the deliberate starting point. It was the first unit with the most critical indicators. Henrique gathered the documents in his briefcase. If the episode had been different, the report would have been different. It wasn't staged, it was available to happen, and it happened. Mauricio stared at him for a long moment. There was something in the older man's expression that was hard to name. It wasn't exactly admiration because it was more complex than that. It was the recognition of someone who had seen a lot over many years and yet was in the presence of a way of operating that was genuinely different. "You never needed a title for a position," Mauricio said. "Titles say what someone is," Enrique responded. "What matters is what someone does." He left with the briefcase under his arm, crossed the room, pressed the elevator button, and waited with his usual patience. The doors opened, he entered, and as the elevator descended through the 24 floors, he opened his phone and began drafting a note for Adriana with the next steps. The work continued, as it always had continued, regardless of who was looking and who was not. 2 months after that Thursday on Faria Lima, the Ventura Premium of that unit had a waiting list for test drives that the manager Cristina had implemented as a policy after finding that demand had increased with the change in the service standard. It was one of the most direct and hardest to predict correlations. When people felt welcome regardless of appearance, more people came. And when more people came, the unit sold more. The indicator that had been the weakest in the network had risen to 3rd place in 2 months. Fernanda Rios arrived at 8 in the morning every Monday for the service team alignment meeting, which had become a weekly ritual since she had taken over supervision. It was a 20-minute meeting, no PowerPoint, no metrics on the screen, just a conversation about what had worked and what could be better. Renan participated with the attention of someone who is still learning, which is the only way to truly learn anything. On one of those Mondays during the meeting, he had said something that Fernanda had noted on the back of a small notepad she used for informal records. The sentence was simple: "We can't serve someone well whom we've already judged." There was a silence after everyone nodded their heads, because it was the kind of thing that, once said, remains evident forever. In the tower on Paulista, the due diligence process with the Group Aresmont had advanced. The documents from the Mystery Shopper program had been presented to the European analysis team, which had responded with a comment that the legal consultant had passed on with more satisfaction than usual. It was, according to them, one of the few documented self-correction processes they had seen in a company in the sector in Brazil that demonstrated organic commitment to culture, not just checklist compliance. The value of the negotiation had risen, not by coincidence. Enrique learned of this on a Wednesday morning when Mauricio called with the update. There was no euphoria in either of their voices. There was the calm recognition that things had followed the logic that careful analysis had suggested they would. "Will you show up for the signing?" Mauricio asked. "If it's useful for me to show up," Enrique replied. "You were always the kind of person who shows up when it's useful and vanishes when it's not. It's frustrating and very efficient at the same time." Enrique left a silence that was the equivalent of a smile. On the afternoon of that same Wednesday, he walked to a café in Pinheiros that he had frequented since he moved to the neighborhood. He ordered a double espresso, sat at a corner table near the window, and opened his laptop with the final report of the 17 units that the program had concluded that week. It was a 43-page document with data, analysis, recommendations, and a set of reference cases that would serve as the basis for the next cycle. He read with his usual attention. He made notes in the margins of the pages with a black ballpoint pen, the same type he had used for years. The city passed on the other side of the glass at maximum speed, and he read at his own speed, which was the only one that made sense for the kind of work he was doing. One of the last pages of the report contained a paragraph he had written weeks earlier, but reread now with the distance that time gives. The problem of judgment by appearance in premium service environments is not a training problem. It is a belief problem. Whoever judges a customer by their clothes or the car they arrived in believes at some level that a person's value can be read in external markers. This belief does not change with a procedure manual. It changes when the person understands, through their own experience or through careful observation, that they are wrong. Management's role is not to punish the belief. It is to create conditions for the experience that changes the belief to happen. He read the paragraph twice. He made a small mark in the corner, indicating he wanted to use it in the final presentation. Then he closed the laptop, finished the espresso, left the tip on the tray, and left the same way he had entered. On the sidewalk of Pinheiros, with the noise of the city around him and the afternoon sun breaking between the buildings, there was something that was hard to capture in a report or in a board meeting, but which was the real basis of everything that had happened in the last 2 months. The conviction that places where people are treated well regardless of appearance are not just fairer places, they are better places for everyone, for those who serve, for those who are served, and for those who at some point in the structure make the decisions that define what those places will be. Henrique walked back to the apartment with his hands in his pockets and the laptop under his arm. He passed a newsstand, a bakery with the smell of bread coming out the open door, 2 people sitting on a park bench, talking. São Paulo, on the neighborhood scale, still had that human texture that the speed of the avenue hid. He went up, made a coffee, sat on the bench near the piano which he had played for 15 minutes the previous night for the first time in weeks. And he stood looking at the city with the silence of someone who is at peace, not with the absence of problems, but with the certainty of being in the right place doing what is right to do. The call had not summoned help, it had summoned consequence, and the most important consequence had not been the removal of 2 employees or the board meeting or the European proposal. It had been Monday morning in a store on Faria Lima, where a service supervisor gathered the team for 20 minutes to ask what had worked and what could be better. That was, in the end, what truly changed a place. End of story of. Dear listener, if the story of Henrique and Ventura Premium touched something in you, if at any moment you saw yourself in that white armchair, waiting calmly or on the other side of the counter, realizing too late that you had judged before hearing, then you know exactly why we tell stories like this, because fiction, when it is honest, reveals what reality prefers to hide. If you made it this far, it wasn't by accident. You are the kind of person who stays until the end, and it is exactly for you that we prepare the next stories, all with the same dedication, the same depth, the same characters that stay with you. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of them. Leave your like, because it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to reach more people. And in the comments tell us, have you ever been judged by your appearance, or have you ever been on the side that judged? We want to read. See you in the next story.